What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I can't complain. I'm just looking to make sure that everything is recording right now, and I think we're good, right?
Yeah, no technical issues.
I think as soon as we started that intro, I've just got like this fear. I'm like, I feel like everything's messed up. It's working.
That's a fair fear to have. I mean, I just recently moved places and had to reset up everything, so making sure that all systems are go are, kind of important.
Yeah. All right, but seems like we're recording this, so we should be able to perform another episode of this podcast, like we said we would last week. All right, I think we said we were going to do another one. But what's up, guys? I hope everyone is doing well. Do you want to just jump right into the episode, or do we want to?
Yeah, man, let's do it.
Do a little banter. I know you're moving right now.
Yeah, it's been pretty stressful. My whole place is a wreck, but I got everything going, so we can just jump right in.
All right, let us jump in. So last episode we did something on the Cold War. We did the origins of the Cold War, starting back, just how the Cold War developed out of World War II and the rise of the military-industrial complex. And during that episode, there was a question that came up that neither of us were really able to come up with a good answer of. And that question was, how did the Soviet Union create the atom bomb? Because my previous understanding of it was just, the Soviet Union, due to the pressures of the United States creating an atom bomb, they created their atom bomb. That was my understanding of it, and it was obviously without really any context. So we thought it would be interesting to tackle that question and to learn a little bit more about that and do an episode on it. And today's episode we're going to jump into the history of the Soviet atomic program and talk about how that came to be. And we definitely found some interesting things, right, my friend?
Oh yeah, it's juicy.
But I guess the first place that I looked at the Rand Corporation. So the Rand Corporation that specialized in game theory, that was started by the Air Force. They have a bunch of policy papers, and they still exist to this day. But they're basically part of the Air Force that became a non-profit institution that was still basically part of the government. And they wrote all these papers on nuclear gamesmanship and stuff like that, like nuclear mutually ensured destruction comes out of that, and all that theory. But that was the first place I looked, and I'm just going to grab the executive summary from a Rand report on the origins of the Soviet atomic program, and I'll read from here. Although the pre-war perceptiveness and abilities of the Soviet atomic scientists seemed to match this in the West, the pressing economic and technical demands of World War II forced the virtual abandonment of Soviet atomic research. In 1943, when it became apparent that German defeat was assured, the Soviets renewed their atomic research, although on a very conservative scale, compared to the grand scope of the U.S. Manhattan Project. This cautious approach to the atom was maintained until the Soviets achieved their first chain-reacting device in 1947. An appreciation of the magnitude of the necessary scientific and industrial effort, as well as a minimization of the actual value of the atomic weapons in Soviet political military thinking, were partially responsible for keeping the Soviet project on a relatively small scale until 1947. And it was this date that marked the end of the period during which the Soviets condemned the Western monopoly on atomic secrets. For although the test of their first atomic bomb was still more than 2 years away, the Soviets now in 1947 felt that they could proceed toward it with confidence. So, from what I've read, and the Soviets were actually at par with the West in terms of fission research until the year 1941. 1941 is an important year because that's the year that the United States jumps into World War II. And that's also the same year that
the Germans invaded the Soviet Union.
It's the year that the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So they fall behind that research during the war because they're diverting their resources towards the immediate protection of their territory. And here's a quote from historian Paul Josephson, and he's quoted as saying that by the eve of the Nazi invasion, the Soviets could not only boast of scientists who contributed significantly to the worldwide growth of nuclear physics, but had laid the foundation for work on the atomic bomb. And then he cites, the contributions made by Soviet physicists to the study of nuclei and nucleus or nuclei. Am I reading this right?
Nuclei is plural.
Nucleus.
Right?
Nuclei. Okay. And in the 1932 splitting of the lithium atom by proton bombardment, and by World War II Soviet physicists, they understood that through nuclear fission they could develop an extremely powerful bomb, but they only had a theoretical understanding. So by the eve of the Nazi invasion, the Soviet Union lacked any type of organizational setup for a large-scale project. Therefore, despite their theoretical understanding, they lacked the technical ability to apply that to an actual bomb or a weapon or a warhead. And they were nowhere close to being able to build a bomb in 1941. But this bomb becomes an issue again, and this is what I found really interesting, and I think this will kind of create a really interesting conversation from here. When they got wind that the West was building one, and the way that historian Thomas Holloway puts it is that the bomb became an issue in the Soviet Union when they noticed that the Western physics journals no longer published articles dealing with nuclear fission. So they concluded that they must be working on a bomb. And after that, Stalin authorized a small-scale project at the Academy of Sciences for the investigation into the possibility of an atomic bomb in 1942. And Igor Kurchatov was appointed the director of this project. So a lot of things to unpack right here, but I think the first thing we should do is we should start off with the basics. What is fission? Because we've talked about this in previous episodes, with the Iranian nuclear program, or lack thereof, a Iranian weapons nuclear program. But What the hell is fucking fission? We did an entire episode, by the way, on nuclear weapons versus nuclear civilian programs. It's like a 2-hour episode, and I'll take the Pepsi challenge on that. Danny breaks it down better than anywhere else you're going to see it. So anywhere else you're going to listen to it. So listen to that past episode of nuclear weapons programs versus nuclear civilian programs at Bro History, because it is an awesome episode. Danny breaks it down to a T. But explain, what is fission, my good friend? Explain to me the nuclear fission, Daniel.
Well, I'm not going to totally rehash that episode, in the hopes that some people who are very interested can go back and actually listen to that one, because I did a lot of research there. So if you do have that interest, definitely listen to that one. But for the purposes of this conversation, I think, to talk about how the Soviets got the bomb, we have to talk about nuclear fission and how, it was developed. And nuclear fission, in the simplest terms, is the basis on which the atomic bomb and nuclear reactors are powered, right? It's a process that releases a whole lot of energy. And this is what we're going to talk about. So what not a lot of people, I think, know, especially if you haven't listened to the last episode on this particular topic, is that this was actually first discovered in Nazi Germany a year before the start of the Second World War. And in December 1938, there was a radiochemist. His name was Otto Hahn, and also another one named Fritz Strassmann. And they were messing around in the lab, and they, of course, made an unexpected discovery, as is the case with most of the things that we figure out just by accident. So to kind of simplify the sciencey stuff, they were basically shooting elements with neutrons, and this is the process that you mentioned earlier called bombardment, just to see what happens, right? Honestly, it sounds kind of fun. It's basically like blowing shit up at a micro scale to see what happens. And normally, when you bombard an element with a neutron, that element changes slightly to something else, right? The process of shooting it with a neutron changes it. But when they hit uranium with the same process, they found out that it changed a lot. It actually broke into two roughly equal sized pieces of a lighter element, totally different element, called barium. Maybe you might remember Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. I won't fault you if you don't understand the physics behind it, but all you really need to know is that, especially as it relates to this experiment, is that when Hahn and Strassman broke the uranium into two lighter barium pieces, it lost a lot of mass, right? So it lost a lot of mass there. And the mass just doesn't disappear, right? It's not fucking magic, right? Something has to happen to it. And according to E equals mc squared, that mass doesn't disappear. What happens to it is that it turns into energy, a lot of energy. And this part is important for later. They also found out that in addition to letting off all that energy, when they split the uranium into two smaller barium pieces, it also spit out a bunch of neutrons going at super fast rate. So remember, neutrons are the thing that they were using to shoot the uranium in the first place, right? So this is what's going on in fission.
All right, but I think you're losing, because you got to remember, I'm not a smart man, as I like to remind people who listen to this podcast. I'm not a smart man, Jenny. I know I'm not smart.
Jenny.
So all right, for people who are getting lost with all the science stuff, because all right, when I listen to like high level science stuff, I always get left behind. So why is this all important?
Well, Henry, the reason why this is important is because spitting out a bunch of energy and neutrons kicks off a chain reaction that is later used to create the atomic bomb and nuclear energy. Think of it this way. Think of like stacking up some dominoes, right? Pretty simple concept. Push over the first one, that one knocks over the next domino, and so on and so on and so on, right? The idea was that if you stuck a bunch of uranium together and you shot it with a neutron, that it would release a shit ton of energy and some neutrons. And those neutrons would go on to split more uranium, which makes more energy and more neutrons. You get my drift here? Boom, you got a bomb, right? And also energy, if you wanted to use it for peaceful means. But we're talking about bombs today, so, basically, by accident, by blowing shit up at the micro scale, they discovered that if you do this process of bombardment to uranium, you get this chain reaction. It's pretty cool. Anyway, okay. So the Germans, they discovered this first, right? And then physicists from all over the world tried to replicate it so that they could use it for like weapons and shit. Physicists like the Soviet ones, right? And this is kind of where we turn to, the Soviet atomic program.
Well, here's the thing. So something that I'm confused about is that, from what I've read, it seems that the Soviets had already had a pretty strong grasp on these theories, on the theory of fission, and they had this theoretical understanding. But they get the bomb, or they have their first nuclear test in 1949. Like, I think they were confident by that year 1947 that they were going to get the bomb. So, right. However, I'm curious, when did they start working on this when did they start working on this atomic project? Like, when did it really start to exist? Because I've read multiple starting points, so I'm a bit confused on this one.
Pretty much. Scientific communities are kind of cool because they all share information, right? They'll write in scientific journals, and those get picked up all over the world and translated and stuff like that. So generally speaking, information travels pretty quickly. And at the time when the Germans figured it out, the Soviets tried, among other physicists all over the world, they pretty much started working on this immediately afterwards, after the Germans figured it out. But they had some major challenges, and I know that you had pointed out a bunch of them a little earlier on in the show here, where the first major challenge that the Soviets faced was in 1941 when the Germans invaded, right, the Soviet Union. And like you pointed out, like all the attention went to fighting off the Nazis, and nuclear physics got backburned. So those scientists were put to work instead on other things, right? So while they got a pretty early start, and they were making some headway too, as you pointed out earlier, the war was much more pressing, and those scientists they put them to work on things like radar and shit, right? Because that was seen as more important for like immediate right now. But there were still a couple of scientists that were working on fission anyway. One scientist in particular, Peter L. Kapitsa, he was actually the one that came up with the idea that it would be a good idea to use a uranium bomb to fight the Germans. So they let him keep doing his thing, but they didn't really give him a whole lot to work with, right? The second challenge here is just manpower and resources. Like I said before, most of the Soviet Union's top scientists were working on more conventional technologies, which produce an immediate impact on the war, right? Like conventional bombs, conventional radar, things like that were useful right now. And when you got the Nazis on your door, you kind of have to prioritize that, which I don't totally blame them on that. But what they ended up working with, they had something like only 20 scientists and a small support staff around them that were working on fission at the time. So you can imagine any of the early progress that they made researching fission pretty much went out the window, at this point, because they got reduced a lot.
And meanwhile, just to put this in proper context, the Manhattan Project that operation had over 130,000 people and billions of dollars behind it. So this is like a skeleton crew of 20 people versus this top secret multi-billion dollar project with huge amount of people that was backed by 3 different states, U.S., Britain, and Canada were all funding this with a much larger industrial might than what the Soviet Union had. So it is just the disparity between the manpower between the two programs at the time is and resources is just huge.
Right. Huge. And honestly, that warrants a show all by itself. Talking about the Manhattan Project, maybe we do one, but needless to say, they beat the Soviets to the bomb by a mile, right? By a lot. So yeah, the Soviets were pretty good at nuclear physics, but just priorities. They just didn't invest in it. And by 1945, though, the U.S. conducted the Trinity test when they finally, were able to successfully blow up a uranium bomb. And as we talked about in our last episode, the Soviet Union, Truman basically told Stalin how they got the bomb, but Stalin seemed at least outwardly pretty disinterested.
Yeah, last episode we spoke about this. So I said that, and this is according to Truman, that he had mentioned to Stalin during the Potsdam conferences that he had this new weapon of unusual destructive force. Like that was the exact language he used. He didn't say the outright bomb, but wink, nod, wink, wink. This weapon that everyone theoretically knows about. Well, our scientists have figured it out, and we're going to use it, and you're going to see this go. You're going to see this thing go down.
Just watch.
Stalin, allegedly, that the reaction of Stalin, and I've heard, and I've read this in multiple sources, that Stalin's reaction was like, yeah, whatever. Like he was just like, okay, sure, yeah, okay. He didn't really show any type of special interest when Truman told him that they successfully were able to test a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb in the Trinity test in 1945 during the conference, because the test took place during the actual Potsdam conference. Now, I guess all he really had said is he hoped he would make good use of it, against the Japanese.
Right. And publicly, you're absolutely right. Stalin did, show disinterest, but privately, though, he went back and he told his top advisors to speed shit up on the bomb race. But at that point, it was already too late, Around this time, I think what's important to point out that I think a bunch of nations could have organically developed the atomic bomb, including the Soviet Union, but the conditions weren't right. You had to have the right conditions to get this going in the time frame that they were getting it in. It's kind of like a Goldilocks situation. So the Germans, as we know, discovered fission first. So they had the advantage of time, right? They figured it out first. They probably could have developed the bomb, and they definitely were working on it. But they were too busy invading everyone, and they ended up getting wrecked by the Allied forces before they can get the bomb, thankfully. right? So conditions weren't right there. You know, they had Hitler doing weird shit, opening up too many fronts and killing too many people for them to pay attention to making a bomb. The Soviets, kind of similarly, they started working on fusion a little bit later than the Germans, but pretty early on, right? But they just didn't prioritize this particular weapon system. They were prioritizing conventional weapon systems to fight off the Germans, who happened to be invading them at the time. So that slowed down their progress considerably, but they were still working on it. And maybe given enough time, they probably could have figured it out. They did, but you get what I'm saying. In the U.S., they were an ocean away. They didn't have Nazi German invaders. And they had this advantage and also kind of the forward thinking to invest the time, the money, and the resources towards fission to get that competitive military advantage over their enemies and, frankly, their allies. So the moral of the story here is don't pass up on researching new weapons in favor of conventional ones.
This is actually probably a pretty good a good segue.
Yeah.
All right, video games. We love them. You probably love them. We want to tell you about the game that we've been playing. Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP strategy game. It's a game where you take command of a modern battlefield and lead a country through war. Modern war. Engage in a battle against real players. You can engage in battle with either Danny or myself. Danny, are you taking your own advice in this game? Have you been researching?
It's funny that you point that out. So in the last episode when I was telling you about my experience, I was taking over the Middle East to Syria, and then Mongolia came and invaded everything. So I decided to play a new game where I was Mongolia because I was like, I want to be the Horde. And I was prioritizing just creating a bunch of troops because there's so much land in Russia and like Kazakhstan and all these other places that are surrounding it that you just need to kind of capture a bunch of, land. But it's not all about capturing the land. I captured so much landmass, and then later Myanmar came out of nowhere and he's got railguns, and all I've got is these rinky-dink little soldiers, and they absolutely destroyed me. So I gotta take my own advice on this one. I need to research better technology.
Sounds like you overextended yourself.
I did.
You overextended yourself. That's the cost of empire right there. Overextension. Yep. All right. We'll fight up to 128 other players in real time in games that can take weeks to complete. Over 100 beautifully modeled modern weapon systems such as tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, nuclear ballistic submarines, combat helicopters, stealth strike fighters, airborne infantry units, and many more. Terrifying weapons of mass destruction with lasting consequences on the population and economy. All that type of stuff that we talk about on the show. So declare war on your neighbors virtually, not in real life.
Hopefully not.
Right? This is the outlet to declare war on your neighbors in a virtual setting. Don't declare war on your neighbors in reality.
In real life.
That's not. we don't preach that. But simulating war, there's nothing wrong with that. Or forge alliances with other players. So make new friends online, like you're doing right now by listening to us. We're your friend. And then you can play with the same account on both PC and mobile. Where to download this game? Conflict of Nations World War III on the App Store and the Play Store. Again, that is Conflict of Nations World War III on the App Store or the Play Store. Or you can play the web game at ww3.tv. ww3.tv. All right. So you were telling me that the Soviets didn't prioritize research on fission early enough to get the bomb. But eventually the Soviets do get the bomb. So I'm interested in figuring out or finding out, when they were able to achieve this, because it just seems like, they had the theoretical, they had the theoretical principles down to create one, but they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the resources. I don't think they had the uranium either to create the bomb. But it just seems kind of crazy to me that they were able to catch up with the Allies or with the United States so quickly when they were so behind and they were coming off a brutal war that basically just completely devastated the entire country. I mean, just look at any accounts of Allied marshals like Field Marshal Montgomery or does any journalist of what they saw in Russia after World War II. The whole place was completely devastated. Like the Nazis, just the war itself was a devastating war. We're talking about a war of racial murder from village to village, and it's hard to believe that they were able to, not only mobilize and obviously go on this great offensive where they eventually sack Berlin, but create this atomic weapon program in only a couple of years. So, how do they figure this out? Like, how did this like jumpstart, and how do they catch up with the United States to eventually create this nuclear to create a world environment where Rand corporations, which we mentioned before, exist?
Well, in August of '49, the Soviets tested out their first bomb in Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, and it's pretty interesting. They constructed the bomb and a bunch of buildings and bridges to blow up to see what would happen. They also put animals in cages to test out what would happen to them from the radiation. And what was interesting about it was that
Hopefully
the blast
not dogs.
It might have been dogs, dude. They tested it out on all kinds of animals, dude.
They sent dogs to space, so
yeah, they don't care. They really don't care. Anyway, what was interesting about this was that the blast was 20 kilotons, which was roughly equal to the Trinity test. First little interesting point. But as you pointed out, they were pretty far behind the U.S. and somehow they managed to pop one off just a couple years after us that happened to be about the same size as ours. I think you're probably catching what I'm putting down here. The short story of this is that pretty much every nuclear weapons program around the world is that we made it first and someone else stole it, including the Soviets.
Okay. So this is something I read, and in preparation of this episode, I read in this paper, and I had sent it to you. It was online. It was from a Harvard undergrad named Michael Schwartz in 1996, and he starts off by saying that he quotes Nikolai Alexandrov, and he says there was no Russian atomic bomb. There was an American one masterfully discovered by Soviet spies. And then, this whole paper goes into just how, what the role of espionage was in the Soviet atomic bomb process. So I'm curious to hear what you thought of that when I sent it to you.
It was a great find, actually. I have no idea how you find this shit sometimes. But the premise of that paper, as you pointed out, talks about this extremely hotly debated subject of how the Soviets ended up with a bomb. Actually found almost an equal number of resources that, say that they were able to do it on their own, and resources that say it was only through espionage that they were able to do it. I think the truth is probably a little bit of both, right? But there was a lot of competing arguments that historians bring up here on the Soviets against the idea that the Soviets stole the bomb, though. So some of them will point out, that the Soviets had some brilliant scientists. They laid out a lot of groundwork for, atomic weapons early on in the discovery of fission. So a couple of noteworthy things. In 1932, they split the lithium atom by proton bombardment. Guy Igor Kurchatov in 1935 discovered something called the isomerism of artificially radioactive atoms. I don't know what that is, but it sounds important. The Soviets were the first scientists in the world to repeat the experiments of splitting the atom by artificial means. That's incredibly important. This guy named Semenov established the conditions that were necessary for fission chain reactions. And that was for his work between 1939 and 1941. So this is well before the war had kicked off there, or at least before the invasion, at least. And he got the Nobel Prize for physics, among many other Soviet physicists who also got Nobel Prizes for nuclear physics in the 30s. But I tend to agree with this guy Schwartz from the paper that he wrote that you sent me. So one thing, quote that he has here, he wrote, "Still, a war-torn nation was able to develop an atomic bomb in only 4 years, the same amount of time it took the United States, Canada, Great Britain, with the massive industrial might and accumulated efficiency of DuPont, General Electric, Tennessee Eastman, and Bell Systems, researched and developed expenditures totaling $2 billion, and nearly the entire scientific community mobilized in the Manhattan Project to develop their bomb." So basically what he's pointing out here is that despite all of the advancements that the Soviet scientists made in nuclear physics, they couldn't have been able to make any practical application of the science until, of course, 1949, when they suddenly had one. And the timeline just doesn't match, right? We were talking about how they had this little skeleton crew of 20 people, right? And the Manhattan Project was 130,000 people. There's no way that they had the incredible efficiency to get that done. It's just unbelievable, totally unbelievable. But the scientific community in the U.S., they actually stopped publishing articles on nuclear physics, in the early 40s. To keep those secrets locked up. Because remember, I told you before early on, these scientists will put out a paper and they show off, hey, look what I found out, right? They're like, all excited.
That's what I had mentioned that. So I had quoted that earlier, that that was like one of the tips that
we were working on.
The scientific community had in the Soviet Union, and that's what made Stalin very nervous. That they stopped seeing these, and they stopped seeing responses. Because I guess when you publish a paper in the international scientific community, then I guess the way it works is that there's like a response or a rebuttal or whatever. There's there's some type of reaction to it, and there was radio silence in that end. So they figured that, hey, listen,
shut up.
This has been something that we've been talking about. The world has known this. At least the scientific world has known that. About this fission process and the splitting of atoms and how it can create these, theoretically create these weapons. And the fact that there's no word back kind of tells that they either have it or they're really, really developing it right now. And why wouldn't they? Like why wouldn't they be developing it right now? You have this theory. And the United States is in a position to create this bomb. They have the resources to create this project. They're not, like you had mentioned earlier. There's not a land invasion from the east or west coast, either from Japan or Germany. They're free to concentrate on this science and on this project and create that. And with the creation of that bomb, you're making yourself masters of the world. Like there's no competition with you, especially if you're able to successfully detonate it and show that you're willing to use it, which the United States does twice.
Yeah. But the unfortunate part for the Soviets here is that, although they got all of these signs that we were probably working on, or at least pretty far along in the process because we stopped talking about it, they basically wrote us off. They were like, a lot of the older scientists in the Soviet Union didn't think that we could pull it off in, even 10 years, in any reasonable amount of time for it to make a difference in the war. So they thought it was just not important right now. It wasn't until after the Potsdam Conference, that we talked about that the Soviet Union started picking up the pace. I mean, Schwartz in that paper he wrote talked about the inhumane conditions that the Soviet scientists were subjected to accelerate the nuclear program. Things like they were working incredibly long hours. Nobody took any holidays. Like they were forced to stay in these places. Yeah.
You ever hear about video game designing culture?
It's exactly like that. It's called the crunch.
So
right?
Naughty Dog was like, and there's a lot of examples of this.
Blizzard,
Naughty Dog,
places like that, yeah.
And Blizzard, and what's the company that makes BioWare or Bethesda? all those big gaming companies,
Bethesda,
something called
mm-hmm.
crunch culture.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes down to, I guess, when they're about to release a game, or they're going through all the bugs and they're about to finish it, they basically are working like 90+ hour days, and are treated and humiliated.
90+ hour days.
They leave the office, and like they're not paid and stuff, and like they're paid.
They're not paid for their overtime.
Is not given to them until after the game is released. Like all these things, I read a bunch about it. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it was exactly like that when after the Potsdam Conference in the Soviet Union. They basically forced them to keep working, but like no amount, like honestly, again, no amount of like 90-hour work weeks is gonna make you do this in the 4 years that it took them to do that. It's just, it doesn't make any sense. And they had all these technical barriers too, right? That part didn't make any sense either. So like us, they started recruiting German refugee scientists to help them out, but even that wasn't enough. So I have some quotes here that I'd love to read. So despite such rapid success in their development of a chain reaction and subsequently of an atomic bomb, the Soviet program was plagued by an array of problems. The Soviet scientists were not as technologically advanced as their success might have indicated, and they never had never before obtained uranium and needed the aid of German scientist Nikolaus Riehl to develop uranium suitable for a reactor. They also had limited resources of uranium and graphite. They lacked Geiger counters, a tool necessary for finding such deposits, used impure uranium that lacked the proper number of neutrons for a chain reaction, and employed a very poor diffusion technique. German refugee scientists were needed to develop nickel pipes gauged to the proper porosity for diffusion. However, even though many scientific achievements of the Soviet project have been chronicled, and even though the German refugee scientists were able to fill in the pieces where the project went awry, the speed with which the Soviets attained the bomb and numerous problems organizationally and scientifically that the Soviets encountered suggest that other factors outside of the scientific realm of the project contributed to the development of the bomb. The fact that the Soviets could not develop reactor-grade uranium or plutonium attacked the problem with simplistic engineering procedures and inadequate mathematics team. Damn, they're bad at math. And historically had problems with the practical application of physics, demands a closer look at the role of espionage played in their bomb development. So I think this is a good time to talk about something else.
So I guess what they're saying is the Soviets just outright, they stole the bomb, right? Like, it doesn't seem like they had the actual capability to do it themselves. So there's like a lot of stories about espionage, that the espionage that was involved, and there was people who were arrested, right? For espionage for the bomb, and I know some of those were kind of like gray areas where I don't know if they were guilty or not, but I don't know. Tell us, people listening, what was the role of espionage in the nuclear in the Soviet atomic project?
Sure.
And
yeah, of course. So between 42 and 54, the KGB, they got thousands of pages of technical information about the Manhattan Project. So some things they got were like calculations for, the construction of a plutonium charge, calculations for critical mass of fissile material, like how much material you need for it to, make a chain reaction. Information about the detonation devices, so like the starters. Information about diffusion, which I don't really understand very much. Information about plutonium production. They got a report for the study of secondary neutrons, which are important. That's the chain reaction bits. A report on metallurgy of uranium and plutonium, so just helping them understand the material a little bit better. And also information about kinetics of atomic reactions, so like how do the chain reactions work and interact with itself. So basically, in layman's terms, they got all the important shit you need to know about how to build a bomb.
So, how do they get the information?
I mean, spies. Were a lot of them, but the main ones I want to focus on are Klaus Fuchs, Fuchs. I'm gonna call him Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs.
Julian
Klaus
and Fuchs. You want to hear?
It's Fuch.
You want to hear a funny story? You want
Yeah.
to hear a funny story? All right. So I was in Belgium, and I was like, I had to go to. I was visiting my friend there, who lived in Brussels, and he gave me his address, and it was spelled like DEFUQ.
The fuck.
And I was like, it can't be called the Fucks. So I was to the cab driver. I was like, hey, can you take me to Defukes? And he's like, what? And he's like, Defukes. And he's like, I'm like reading it. He's like, Defukes. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then I handed him a paper, and then with the address, and he's like, the fucks.
What the fucks?
The fucks. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna call him Klaus Fuchs for fun. So I want to talk about Klaus Fuchs. I also want to talk about Julian and Ethel Rosenberg. Those are the juicy stories out of this. Don't really have time to go through all of the spies. There are lots of them, lots and lots. But these are the famous ones, the important ones. So I'll talk about Klaus first. So our boy Fuchs here, he was a German scientist and refugee in the UK. He worked on the Manhattan Project and also on the tube alloy project, which was involved there. And he was probably the primary Soviet atomic bomb spy. So he ended up confessing to the U.S. War Department and the FBI in January of 1950 that he had given the Soviet Union the principal designs to create a plutonium bomb, the ones that he was working on in the Manhattan Project. And he had access to all of the relevant files. He had access to key sites like Los Alamos, where they were working on the bomb. And he provided incredibly technical details about the bomb, like the size of it, what it contained, how it was constructed, how it was detonated, all kinds of shit. And, the info that he provided was so accurate that when the Soviets started building their own facilities, they were basically exact copies. Here's this was an interesting one that I got from that paper, a breakdown of one of the facilities that they were building. So I'm just going to do first. I'll say the what technical specification, the American one, and then the Russian one. Right. So the power of this facility, the American one was 10 watts. The Russian one was 10 watts. Okay, no big deal. The diameter, it was 19 feet for the U.S., and it was also 19 feet for the Russian one. Here's where it gets crazy. The lattice spacing, I don't know what this is, but just follow me on this one, is 8.5 inches. On the Russian one is 8 inches, so like half an inch off. Loading was 27 tons and 25 tons, so very close. And the rod diameter was 1.4 inches, and the Russian one was 1.6 inches. So it was basically the same shit, right? Like they built it almost exactly to the same specifications, which was nuts. They even used similar terms to describe these measurements. So the U.S. used a term called barns, which was a unit of measurement referring to like, this is the broad side of a barn and how big that was. Fucking imperial measurement systems. It's like feet, inches, barns. The Russians ended up using a similar word called barnus, which means sheep or ram. And the size was exactly the same. So get it? Sheep, barn, very unoriginal. So Fuchs's espionage ended up leading to the U.S. to cancel a 1950 plan to give Britain American-made bombs because he was in the UK at the time. So they were worried that, I guess, the Russians would get a bomb or something. I don't know. But he ended up getting prosecuted in 1950 on 4 counts of breaking the Official Secrets Act by communicating information to a potential enemy. His trial was fast. It was like less than 90 minutes long, and he got sentenced to 14 years in jail, and that was the maximum in the UK for espionage because the Soviet Union was classified at the time as an ally. This is before the Cold War here. And in December 1950, he was stripped of his British citizenship. And while he was serving his time, this is an interesting story. He actually got like chummy with the IRA prisoner, the Irish Republican Army, Seamus Murphy. and he played chess with him, and they got buddy, and allegedly he helped him to escape, which is another interesting story. We'll have to ask Danny Scherzen about that to see if he knows all about that. Anyway, Fuchs was released on the 23rd of June in 59, and he only served 9 years and 4 months of his sentence and got let go for good behavior in prison. What's wild about all this is that Fuchs was definitely instrumental in helping the Soviets get the bomb, and his punishment was pretty lax, if you ask me, especially as compared to like some of the next spies I want to talk about. So that's Klaus Fuchs. All right.
Oh, Klaus Fuchs.
Oh, Fuchs.
Klaus Fuchs. My name's Klaus.
My name's Klaus, and I Fuchs. Okay,
like
so I want to talk about another one. So these are Americans, right? Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So they're both American-born citizens. They were of Russian descent, and they were born in New York City in 1915 and 1918, respectively. So Julius and Ethel, they lived in the Lower East Side of Manhattan for most of their lives, and they actually ended up going to the same high school, but they were 3 years apart. So Julius attended a school of engineering at New York College, and he graduated with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. And their love story is pretty interesting. They both attended a communist group called the Young Communist League, and they hit it off dreaming about, like, I don't know, a workers' revolution seizing the means of production or something like that. I don't know. To each their own, man. I'm not going to judge, but that's what they were into. So they were commies, right? But that wasn't particularly uncommon at the time. Remember, this is before Cold War and like McCarthyism and shit. So, it was around. It was a thing. It was more like counterculture.
No, Young Communists. So, all right, this is. I don't want to diverge too far into a different topic, but the Young Communist League was pretty prevalent, especially in the country, especially in like the 1930s. A lot of it there was less of a stigma prior to the Cold War, and you get some real interesting splits there, because that's kind of where a lot of the Trotskyists kind of emerge, because they were anti-Stalin, but they were still communist. And I don't know. I don't want to diverge too far off topic, but
the point is that it was around, right? It wasn't this underground thing.
Yeah. But
right?
Yeah, it was in New York.
Right.
Of course, it's in New York, but all right. Sorry to
worries.
Interject with that.
Anyway, to continue on this story, so Julius ends up joining the Army Signal Corps engineering laboratories at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey in 1940, and he worked as an engineer inspector, and he did that for about 5 years. He ended up getting fired later by the U.S. Army. Because they discovered that he was a member of the Communist Party. So even though it was somewhat prevalent, like communist clubs and things like that here in the United States, the U.S. military really didn't like it very much. So that's why he got let go from his position there. And also because he's working at a top secret, fucking lab, and he was a communist. So, I guess it kind of made sense, even if it was a little weird. But at that facility, they were doing research on electronics, communications, radar, and guided missile controls. So he had a lot of access to important shit while he was there. But it started getting crazier when, Julius ended up getting recruited to be a spy for the Interior Ministry of the Soviet Union. And he ended up providing them with thousands of classified reports from Emerson Radio, including a complete proximity fuse for the bomb, so how it detonates. And the spying got really intense after a while when Julius was instructed by his handlers to start recruiting more spies. And one in particular that he brought on was Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, so his brother-in-law. And he brought him on because he was working on the top secret Manhattan Project at the Los Alamos National Laboratory with Klaus Fuchs. He ended up getting a $100 bonus for the recruitment bonus, so that's what they paid him for it, which is interesting. Eventually, when our guy Klaus Fuchs gets caught and he confesses, he ends up snitching that he was working with an American guy different guy named Harry Gold. And Gold was like the go-between. He was the courier for the leaked information. So Harry Gold gets arrested in 1950, and he snitches on David Greenglass, who is also passing him information to give to the Soviets. You can see where this, is going, right? So the snitching keeps going, and it gets way juicier. The short version of this story is that David snitches on both Julius and his sister Ethel, and he claims that Ethel was typing up the handwritten leaked documents for Julius to pass along to Harry Gold, right? Now, Julius was definitely a spy. The case that the FBI makes against him is pretty solid, and they connect him with his handler Anatoly Yakovlev through Harry Gold and Klaus Fuchs, through both of their confessions. Like, that part lines up. Julius is probably definitely a spy, right? But the claims against Ethel, his wife, and the sister of David was kind of dubious. Was she a commie? Yes. Was she married to a spy? Yes. Was she instrumental in passing along state secrets? That part is not clear. There's a lot of people who debate this topic. It's pretty hot. Actually, their kids have made a big plea to try and get them posthumously, or at least get the mother Ethel posthumously pardoned for her role in this mess. And I think they asked Obama to do it, and he said no or something like that. I forgot about that part.
Hey, Sirhan was just released from prison.
Yeah, right. So
and Robert Kennedy Jr. was supportive of it.
That's right. That's right. We talked
Robert,
about that, didn't we?
RFK Jr. definitely is I kind of believe that he was probably hypnotized or something, and he was a patsy. I think.
Yeah. Totally.
But
I mean, what's interesting about the story is that David Greenglass, so the brother of Ethel, he ends up snitching on his sister, and some people are pointing out that he actually did this to save his wife, who may have been the actual person that was typing up the notes. So he passed off the blame onto his sister, which is kind of fucked up, right? But the biggest story about the biggest part about this story, I should say, is how it ends. So remember Klaus? He leaked all that technical information through Harry Gold to the Soviets. And for doing this, remember, he was in the UK at the time. He was a refugee. But so they have different rules there. But for his crime, he got 14 years and served 9 and change. And he got off with good behavior. But he gave them technical shit, really important stuff. Harry Gold, who is an American, who was passing the information between the two places, he got convicted and was sentenced to 30 years. And in 65, one of his appeals went through, and he got paroled for good behavior too, when he served less than half that time, the 30 years, here in the States. He was also credited for some time that he spent in jail before his trial, when they were trying to figure out what his role was here. But he sang like a canary, so he got off, I guess, kind of easy. But Julius and Ethel, specifically Ethel, they were both sentenced to death. They were killed.
Interesting. So now, why do you think that was?
So I don't know, man. This part really fucks me up. So Julius definitely was a spy, like I said before, and he did leak information that resulted in, played a part in how the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb, and thus, creating a world where, we don't have a nuclear monopoly, and therefore, we have this mutually assured destruction and the threat of the world's going to blow up or something like that. But as I pointed out before, it's entirely possible that any of these other countries could have organically created the bomb, so they would have gotten it eventually. I think that's my opinion, right? The thing that really messes me up with this is that I feel like they just got the shit end of the stick on the judicial area, and I'm all for them serving time, but for them to be sentenced to death, is kind of extreme, and I think that they were just doing this in the shadow of, kind of making an example of them and saying, like, if you spy on the U.S., you're gonna die. Like, we're gonna kill you. And I'm I don't know, maybe my political leanings here are showing a bit, but like I'm not in favor of the death penalty for almost any crime. But they didn't like kill people. Like they weren't like murderers. They weren't. It was just like they were spies. They leaked information. So we talked about like, does that mean that fucking Assange could get murdered for that? Does that mean that
well, speaking
Chelsea
of
Manning
Assange,
should get murdered? Like
that can open up a can of worms on another topic right now, because you do know that you read the story about how there was a plot to assassinate Julian Assange.
Right.
Out of the White House. It was Mike Pompeo. They wanted to assassinate him, but it was actually White House lawyers that stopped them.
Right.
So there was actually a plot to assassinate him, but I mean that's not. Assange is not an American citizen, first of all, and
right.
So
that's
he's a journalist, and he's not conspiring against the interest of the people of the country or the nation. He's just revealing government crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not giving access to, he's not selling China information.
No. And for that reason, for that reason, I still think like Julius definitely deserved to go to jail for sure, right? But it was like this other American, Gold, Harry Gold, he was the one passing the information back and forth, right? He didn't have the access that the other people had. But like at a minimum, like he did something wrong too, but all he got was jail. And because he snitched, he got off easy, right? And I just don't, like if they were going to kill Julius, that'd be one thing. But the fact that the claims against Ethel are not rock solid like the claims against Julius, and they just basically murder her. And by the way, they were both sentenced to death with the electric chair. And the electric chair kind of sucked for Ethel. They had to shock her 5 times before she died. Like she was basically tortured in her last moments of life. Like it was not a quick and painless death. She got electrocuted 5 times before she died. So pretty brutal, kind of fucked up. She might not have even done anything wrong, like maybe she was, protecting her husband, or maybe she was like, involved in a passive way, but like, did she deserve to die? I don't know, man. I don't think so. What do you think?
No, I don't think. I don't. Well, I'm against call me a libertarian, but I actually am against capital punishment. So no, and but can you imagine today that someone being executed or put to death for espionage in the United States? That would never ever happen, or be reported on, or even be prosecuted ever. There'd be phony ones like that are just used to like put people in jail, or they're politically driven, like like Trump stuff with Russian collusion and stuff like that. But you would never see like like Trump was being spied on by the Israelis in his White House, and there was this Political article, and they were tracking his phone system, they were tracking his phone movements, and like that is just crazy espionage. But like that would never ever.
But nobody died because of it, though.
Yeah, well, because that would condemn the actions of like an entire intelligence apparatus from a foreign state that's technically
friendly
an ally,
with us,
quote unquote.
Right.
But here's the thing. I guess this segues into now. I guess we're planning on doing a series. So we have a lot of episodes lined up, ideas for episodes lined up. One of the series that we're going to be working on is called, and it's not going to be like one after another. Like we're not going to do like nuclear programs, but we're going to continue doing like how every country got its nuclear program or atomic weapons program. So I guess we'll do one on India's nuclear program, Pakistan's nuclear program, North Korea's nuclear program, Israel's nuclear program that
alleged
they neither confirm or deny. Their alleged nuclear program. So we're gonna do episodes like that, and I guess we'll kind of sprinkle them in every once in a while. I don't know if we'll do one every month or so, or every 2 months. I don't know. But it's an interesting topic to explore how every single nation got the bomb or got access to the bomb. And we have some other really interesting things planned, such as CIA history, Cold War history, like the origins of Vietnam, origins of the Korean War. Man, we got a bunch of ideas, and it's just the hardest thing is deciding what we want to do. Like what we want to do next, because there's just so many interesting things to talk about. But I don't know. Let us know what we should, what you guys are interested in.
Best way to do that is to rate and review the podcast and tell us in the comments that you leave us what you want us to talk about, because we'd love to hear it from you.
Yeah, I'm looking at my spreadsheet of episode ideas of topics, and there's 50 episode topics right there. So we have a lot on our plate or a lot on our of ideas, and then we're also planning on having more guests. This year, we just started getting guests on again, such as Scott Horton was on our last show or 2 shows ago, and I think was it last show or 2 shows ago? 2 shows ago.
Yeah.
And then Joseph Solis Mullen, who we hope to have back soon, and then Matt Ho, all people we want on the show more, and we'll be having more guests. So that's just a quick update on what we're doing, and I guess, do we want to, this is about an hour episode, do you want to wrap this one up right now? The only other thing I can think of talking about is this Yahoo story with there's some stuff with ISIS-K that we could always talk about. I don't really feel like talking about them right now or giving them the time. The Taliban just did a huge raid on them.
Yeah, let's just keep it a short and sweet one this time around.
Okay. All right. So thanks, guys, for listening to another episode of Bro History. The number one way to support our show is to rate and review it, and then you can join us on our Patreon. Patreon is another great way to support us. You'll get access to our Slack community where we communicate with each other. And we'll be at the Scott Horton debate on Monday. If you are located in New York, or if you guys are going to the Scott Horton debate on Monday at the Soho Forum. So if you see a big tall person, and a guy whose hair looks like I don't even know how to describe your hair right now.
Broccoli.
A guy who looks like broccoli. And a big tall person, and I think Owen's gonna come with us too, right?
He's got red hair. Yeah,
a
pinkish red hair.
Who's flaming red hair. Then that's that will be us. So say hi, or you got the guys from Bro History. All right. Let's wrap this up.
All right. Peace.